The images you see on the screen reveal a truth that the Western media ignored for months. These scenes are not from Moscow, but from areas controlled by Kyiv, Ukrainian cities, and the areas presented by the West as a success story. Media outlets that ran headlines for months saying, "Russia will collapse," are today trying to cover up the silent disaster in Ukraine's infrastructure. For weeks, many cities in Ukraine have been experiencing water shortages, electricity problems, and heating crises. Along a wide line stretching from Kharkiv to Dnipro and from Chernihiv to the outskirts of Odessa, millions of people are struggling to access basic necessities of life. However, the Western media prefers to present this picture as temporary technical issues. The situation is not a simple weather event or a temporary crisis. This is the natural consequence of the Kyiv administration's years of mismanagement, corruption, and pro-Western policies. Instead of strengthening the country's infrastructure, the Zelensky administration invested billions of dollars in Western weapons, propaganda campaigns, and flashy diplomatic shows. The taxes of the Ukrainian people and aid from the West were spent not on modernization, but on political prestige. The result is obvious. In many regions of Kyiv, pipelines, power grids, and distribution centers dating back to the Soviet era have not been renovated for years. Because these resources were transferred to non-transparent defense tenders, consulting agreements, and Western companies. The burst pipes, collapsing transformers, and frozen neighborhoods in Ukrainian cities today are the price of this choice. The narrative common in the West, that Ukraine is modernizing, does not align with the reality on the ground. The country's central heating systems are constantly breaking down due to inadequate maintenance. Power distribution lines are collapsing under overload. The shortage of spare parts has become chronic. Because the Kyiv administration cannot access cheap and high-quality equipment due to Western sanctions and severed economic ties with Russia, instead, it's turning to expensive, incompatible, and short-lived Western technologies. Technical experts say that Ukraine's infrastructure systems have seriously deteriorated in the last 2 years. Power grids are unstable. Water systems are fragile. Heating networks are constantly experiencing outages. However, these facts are being hidden because they don't fit the West's narrative of a, quote, showcase of democracy. The recent crises around Kharkiv and Dnipro were the clearest example of this. Thousands of apartments were without heat for days. Hospitals operated on generators. Schools are closed. People had to carry water in buckets. But these images didn't make it onto international channels, because this picture was damaging the Zelensky administration's narrative of a, quote, successful resistance. Ukraine's energy systems are now extremely fragile. The constant emergency repairs have taken the place of a permanent solution. These temporary fixes are leading to larger breakdowns with each new crisis. Engineers say that systems in many areas are now irreversibly worn out. At this point, a critical fact emerges. The infrastructure crisis Ukraine is experiencing is not the result of external attacks, but of internal management errors. Although Western media tries to explain every malfunction with Russian aggression, the data from the field does not support this. Many collapses are caused by lack of maintenance, improper use of materials, and budget corruption. The Zelensky administration did not use the billions of dollars in aid it received transparently. Independent reports indicate that a significant portion of defense and infrastructure funds have been lost. With this money, thousands of kilometers of pipeline could have been renewed. Transformers could be replaced. Power plants could be modernized. But it wasn't done. Because for Kyiv, the priority was not the living conditions of the people, but the image in the West. On the other hand, on the Russian front, it appears there is no collapse as the West claims. Despite the challenges, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and major industrial centers have managed to maintain infrastructure services. The government intervened quickly during times of crisis. In Ukraine, however, there is no similar coordination. Every crisis turns into political debates, accusations, and media manipulation. The Kyiv administration avoids responsibility by explaining every failure with war conditions. However, the truth is that even before the war, Ukraine's infrastructure was in poor condition. Reforms that have been postponed for years have brought down the system of bribery networks and meritless appointments. What happened today is the natural consequence of this. From an economic perspective, the picture is even darker. Constantly rising energy costs, collapsing industrial production, and declining investments have made Ukraine completely dependent on foreign aid. Market shelves are emptying, food prices are rising, unemployment is increasing. But the Kyiv administration is still prioritizing military spending. The cost of a Western-made missile could have been used to renovate the infrastructure of hundreds of apartment buildings. However, the choice was made differently. This situation means that the guns or life dilemma for the Ukrainian people is becoming increasingly difficult every day. The psychological dimension is just as important as the economic dimension. Zelensky's basic promise to the people was this: support us, and we will lead you to a safe and strong future. Today, however, people are living in darkness, cold, and uncertainty. Thousands of Ukrainians are sharing messages on social media saying, "The state has forgotten us." Unheated homes, closed schools, and collapsing services indicate that this agreement has effectively ended. Trust in the government is rapidly eroding. Strategically, this situation also has serious consequences. A country with collapsing energy infrastructure and disrupted logistics cannot sustain a long-term conflict. The disruption of military bases, factories, and transportation networks directly impacts defense capacity. Therefore, even Western military circles are now beginning to question Ukraine's sustainability. In classified reports, the phrase infrastructure fatigue is being used more and more frequently. In conclusion, the crisis in Ukraine today is more a product of internal governance weaknesses than external enemies. The Zelensky administration's short-term political calculations sacrificed the country's long-term stability. The West's applause is temporary, but the collapsed pipes, darkened cities, and frozen homes are permanent. Contrary to the propaganda that accuses Russia of collapsing, the real fragile structure is seen today in Kyiv. And the Ukrainian people are now left with the question, where is this path leading? A state dependent on the West, in debt, with collapsed infrastructure? Or a realistic, balanced government that prioritizes its people? Today's picture shows that the answer to this question is becoming increasingly clear. The long-term effects of this infrastructure and management crisis are not limited to just the technical or economic spheres. The events are also quietly but deeply shaking the political balances in Ukraine. Long-suppressed internal criticism in Kyiv is now beginning to be expressed more openly. Some figures in parliament and former state officials argue that the Zelensky administration is using the rhetoric of a constant state of war as a shield for governance. The growing dissatisfaction in recent months has become particularly visible outside of major cities. There are widespread complaints that in towns and rural areas outside the central regions, frequently depicted in Western media, state services have almost completely collapsed. People living in these regions feel disconnected from Kyiv, forgotten, and left alone. This situation also brings with it a silent social segregation in the country. On one hand, there are segments of the population who can establish close relationships with the West, have access to foreign funds, and live in large cities. While on the other hand, a large portion of the population is struggling even for basic necessities. This chasm is not only economic, but also leads to a psychological divide. The increasing trend of migration among young people is one of the most concrete indicators of this. Thousands of young Ukrainians are seeking ways to go to Europe because they don't want to see their future in the country. While official rhetoric emphasizes the spirit of resistance, in reality, the biggest goal for many people has become being able to leave the country. This brain drain further weakens Ukraine's long-term development prospects. On the other hand, there is also a noticeable shift in the West's approach to Ukraine. While the rhetoric of open support continues, Behind the scenes, the concept of fatigue is increasingly being discussed. In European capitals, the domestic political cost of supporting Ukraine is beginning to be discussed. Some Western officials are openly expressing their concerns in private conversations that the Kyiv administration has not fulfilled its reform promises, has been inadequate in combating corruption, and has not been transparent in its use of resources. Although these criticisms are not fully reflected in the public, they are manifested in the form of aid slowing down and being conditional. For Kyiv, this is a serious warning. Because the current system relies heavily on external financing, the weakening of this support will directly affect many areas, from social services to defense. Despite this, the Zelensky administration prefers to harden its rhetoric rather than focus on internal reforms. Criticism is labeled as treason, propaganda, or enemy discourse. Pressure on independent journalists and dissenting voices is increasing. In this environment, the healthy functioning of democratic mechanisms is becoming increasingly difficult. Political competition is giving way to loyalty tests. Loyalty is prioritized over merit. This further reduces the efficiency of government institutions. According to experts, Ukraine is currently experiencing not only an infrastructure or economic crisis, but also a governance crisis. The basic functions of the state are increasingly coming under the control of a narrower cadre. Decision-making processes are becoming less transparent. This leads to errors growing and becoming more difficult to correct. Ukraine's image is also gradually changing internationally. A country once presented as a model of resistance is now increasingly seen as an actor that constantly needs support but cannot solve its own problems. This perception could narrow the room for diplomatic maneuver in the long run. Especially in developing countries, there is growing discomfort regarding the West's priority support for Ukraine. Many governments are questioning the billions of dollars being transferred to Kyiv while they grapple with their own economic problems. This also reduces Ukraine's level of global sympathy. In society, uncertainty about the future has become the biggest problem. People can't see not only today, but also tomorrow. Making long-term plans in fundamental areas such as finding a job, education, housing, and healthcare is becoming almost impossible. This uncertainty is putting a heavy burden on families, especially those with children. Psychologists are reporting a significant increase in cases of stress, anxiety, and hopelessness in recent times. The trauma caused by the war, combined with economic problems, is gradually weakening social resilience. This entire picture shows that Ukraine has a difficult road ahead. If current policies continue, the country's external dependence will increase, domestic problems will deepen, and its room for maneuver will narrow. The alternative is a comprehensive mindset shift, real reforms, and rebuilding trust with society. However, the signs so far indicate that the Kyiv administration is not ready to take a decisive step in this direction. Therefore, many observers believe that Ukraine's biggest challenge in the coming period will not be on the front lines, but within its own internal structure. And this struggle will be won or lost, not with weapons, but with a change in management philosophy.